Just a few miles outside of Lyme Regis, there lies a village by the name of Bettiscombe, and within that village lies a manor house that's long been the subject of a well-deserved curse. Back in 1635, the lord of the manor was a man named Azaria Pinney. He wasn't a particularly remarkable man and had no particular or discernible talents, so we may never have heard of him had he not chosen to support the Duke of Monmouth during his ill-fated Pitchfork Rebellion. During the bloody assizes that followed their defeat at Sedgemoor, the notorious Judge Jeffreys took great delight at condemning him and his compatriots to be hung, drawn and quartered. However, due to his familial wealth and relatively low standing within the rebel army, this sentence was commuted to exile upon the payment of a £65 ransom. So, once the sum was paid, he found himself sailing towards the West Indian Isle of Nevis, with a mere £15 in his pocket. Of course, I say mere, but back in those days £15 was far more than any ordinary labouring man could ever hope to amass. So, given the coin in his pocket, as well as the privilege and social capital afforded members of the landed gentry, even ones convicted of treason, he was able to purchase an interest in a sugar plantation he later named Maltravers. After 10 years or so heartlessly exploiting the poor souls he enslaved, he managed to amass a new fortune, and with it the influence to soothe the ire held against him in England. So, as soon as he could settle his affairs, he booked passage on a passing ship and set sail back to Lyme Bay. Now, being a man who owed his entire fortune to the cruelty and heartless exploitation of his fellow man, he chose to take one of the men he had enslaved back with him as a perverse trophy of his time in Nevis. I'd love to be able to tell you the man's true name, but as with all those who were kidnapped, consumed and abused by that vile trade, he was stripped of his real name along with any other identifiers of his personhood or culture the moment he set foot on that plantation. All we're left with is the name he was given by his captors, so we shall have to call him John. Given that he knew a refusal would surely have led to vicious reprisals against both himself and those he loved, John had no choice but to go. So he said his goodbyes, and to ensure his safety played the part of the faithful manservant, happy to attend to his captor, all the while sucking down bile and dreaming of ways to return to his wife and child. Tragically though, this was not to be, as during his first winter in England, John was struck down by what was then called consumption, but what we now know today as tuberculosis. Despite a heroic struggle against the ailment, the sickness took him, and he died soon after. However, when he was lying upon his deathbed, he managed to speak to Azaria one last time. Knowing full well that slavers such as him lacked any semblance of compassion or empathy for those they held in bondage, John knew it wasn't worth his time to try and appeal to Azaria's better nature. After all, if he'd had one, he'd never have chosen to enslave his fellow man in the first place. Instead, he chose to appeal to the only things Azaria did hold dear: his wallet and his own neck. "Listen close, Azaria," he said. "You have committed the gravest of sins against me and my people. Sins that shall one day be avenged, if not in this world, then the next. But I shall give you the chance to make one thing right. Once I die, return my body to Nevis so that my family may mourn me, and bury my body according to the traditions of my people. If you do not, then this land and your line shall be cursed from this day until the very last. Your fields will become barren, your fortunes will wither, your reputation will be destroyed, and you'll be driven to madness and death. You have this one chance, Azaria. Take me back, or stand accursed until the end of time." Of course, being the arrogant, self-centered progeny of an arrogant, self-centered family, he scoffed, turned his back and walked away. Like all slaveholders and other such savage beasts wrapped in human skin, he justified the stone-hearted cruelty he inflicted by imagining that all those he exploited were simply lower than he, and therefore deserving of such treatment. Consequently, derision was the only response he had. He'd soon learn, though, and it'd be John's spirit that taught him. Refusing to heed John's warning, Azaria chose to bury him in the graveyard of St. Stephen's Church, and for the first 3 nights after his internment, all seemed well. Then came the 4th night, and with it a discordant symphony of blood-curdling screams, heart-wrenching cries, and deafening thuds, all coming from John's freshly filled grave. Night upon night this cacophony continued, and as it did, every window in the manor house rattled and every door opened and slammed shut in unison. After a week of this, the crops in the field began to wither and turn to ash. The hens began to lay rotten eggs, and the cows gave only sour milk. Seeing that the place was accursed, the labourers and their families abandoned their cottages to beg for asylum on neighbouring estates, and soon the whole of the parish was whispering that Azariah must have invoked the wrath of the devil himself. Soon enough, the village priest was called out, but no amount of Bible readings or holy water could quell the disturbances. Eventually, after months of this torment, the villagers arrived, pitchforks in hand, and descended upon the manor house, demanding Azariah put an end to this madness. In keeping with his character, Azariah shooed them away before retreating inside the manor house. However, at the height of that night's disturbances, driven half mad by the slamming of doors, he screamed, "Enough!" into the night. "Enough! Enough! Enough! I shall do as you bid. I shall return your body to Nevis. Now give me peace!" In that moment, the rattling of the windows and the bellowing from the churchyard ceased, only to be replaced by a low, sinister, rumbling voice that shook the very bones of the house as it spoke. "No, Azariah, you had your chance. You will return my body, but my skull is now your jailer." "Whatever you command me, I shall do," Azariah replied. "Just cease this torment, I beg you." For the remainder of that night, Azariah was indeed granted peace, but they would be the last moments of peace he would ever know. The following day, Azariah ordered John's remains to be exhumed, and upon opening the casket they were greeted by a strange and gruesome sight. Below the neck, John's body lay uncorrupted, even sweet-smelling despite its time under the earth. But from the neck up, all traces of flesh were absent, and his skull lay pristine and smiling. In accordance with John's instructions, Azariah had John's body shipped back to his family in Nevis before bringing his skull back to the manor house. There, Azariah placed it on the mantelpiece and found his eyes being pulled, imperceptibly and unintentionally, towards the skull's empty sockets. As soon as their gazes met, Azariah turned ashen and began to howl as he realized the torture he was about to endure. At that moment, a torrent of visions was unleashed upon him, visions and memories of all those he had enslaved, all the tortures, traumas, humiliations, petty cruelties and gross inhumanity that he and his onlookers inflicted on Nevis now poured unfiltered into his mind. Desperate for relief, he tried to look away, but when he did so, a furious, ear-piercing screeching erupted from the skull's wide, gaping mouth, a scream so intense that his ears began to bleed and his bones began to rattle with such force he was sure that all his joints would soon be torn from their housings. So, without thinking, he turned back to the skull. Trapped as he was between two inconceivable tortures, it eventually occurred to him that without eyes, he would not be able to see the visions. So, one after the other, he wrenched them out with his knife. When the visions continued, he again reasoned that without ears he would not be able to hear the piercing screams, and so used the same implement to root out his ear canals. Not that it worked, mind. Despite this self-mutilation, the visions and screaming still continued. Eventually, made blind and deaf by his own hand and unable to tolerate the agony he had so easily inflicted on others, he used his fingers to find his wrists and ended his pitiful life for good. Days later, when they found him lying in puddles of his own blood and shit, he was still staring into John's empty eye sockets, a twisting, gaping grimace upon his face, pleading for release. Some might even say that it was granted after his death, but I like to think that as soon as Azariah woke up in the pit, for that's where surely he was headed, John's skull was there to meet him. Rather than the intricately carved stone mausoleum he had planned to rest in, Azariah was taken to a patch of unconsecrated ground by a crossroads, and was there buried, in the manner of all suicides, with his limbs bound and a wooden stake driven through his heart. Upon their return to the manor house, the burial party, being good Christian men, thought it only proper that the skull resting atop Azariah's mantelpiece should be taken to the courtyard for a proper burial. However, as soon as they crossed the threshold, the terrible shrieking began once more. So, desperate and panicking, they quickly returned it to the mantelpiece, where it remains to this day. Over the years, many a foolish mind has sought to move it, either out of ignorance or to test the legend, and each time its terrible screaming has forced its return. John's skull has also had a series of other visitors as well, far more trepidatious and afeared. For some strange reason, and no one knows why, at some point in their life, every investor, profiteer, employee, overseer or manager connected to the Mount Travers plantation felt an irresistible pull to come and stand in front of John's skull. Them and all their descendants too. Every bloodline that ever held a whip hand at Mount Travers, everyone who profited either directly or through ancestry from the exploitation and abuse of John's family, sooner or later has to stand and face the sins of their fathers. Of course, John isn't without mercy, and some do get to walk away, but none of them get to forget. People need to be reminded, see. Reminded that all the fine fancy estates, all the carefully cut topiaries, all of the lush verdant lawns, wide Regency streets, statues of pompous gentlemen, and all the wealth behind it that fueled the empire, all of that was built on the broken backs, blood, sweat and tears of battered and bloodied men, far better than those that exploited them. All those who visit the skull, though, they all remember. So, if you ever visit Bettiscombe Manor, and you happen to be of the paler complexion and have a bit of wealth in your family, you might want to stand in front of John and see what he has to show you. If you can face it, of course.